There is something about being a teenager in 1980s America that captures a particular moment in growing up. The mixtapes, the mall hangouts, the freedom of a world without constant connection. And if someone lived through those years, they know exactly what made that decade so unforgettable. This was a time when teenagers ruled the malls, MTV was reshaping music, and Friday nights meant something completely different than they do today. The Cold War still loomed, but for American teens, the biggest concerns were getting the car for Saturday night and whether that cute person in third period even knew they existed. This was the decade that gave us John Hughes movies, arcade showdowns, big hair, and a social landscape that required showing up in person. There were no text messages, no social media, no way to know what anyone was doing unless you called their house and asked whoever answered. Technology was changing, but slowly. Being a teenager meant navigating school, friendships, and first loves with nothing but landline phones and face-to-face conversation. Let's walk through what teenage life actually felt like during that iconic decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it reveals just how different growing up was before the internet changed everything. Let's step into that world. High school in the 1980s was a world unto itself, with its own rules, hierarchies, and rituals. The building itself probably had not changed much since the 1960s. Lockers lined the hallways, and between classes, the corridors became rivers of students moving from one room to the next. There was no checking phones because there were no phones to check. Students actually looked at each other, talked to each other, noticed each other. The social groups were clearly defined and everyone knew where they fit. Jocks wore Letterman jackets and ruled the hallways. Preppies dressed in polo shirts with pop collars and topsiders. The burnouts gathered in the parking lot or behind the gym. New wave kids had asymmetrical haircuts and wore black. Band kids carried instrument cases. Drama kids were dramatic. These categories felt permanent, and crossing between them was rare and notable. Classrooms had chalkboards, not whiteboards. Teachers wrote assignments in chalk that left dust on their hands and clothes. Students took notes by hand in spiral notebooks. There were no laptops, no tablets, no typing anything. Handwriting mattered because everything from essays to notes passed in class required it. Speaking of passing notes, this was the primary form of communication during school hours. Folded pieces of paper with messages inside were passed from desk to desk, hoping the teacher would not intercept them. The anxiety of watching a note travel across the room was real. The school library had a card catalog, an actual cabinet with drawers full of index cards organizing every book. Research meant going through those cards, finding the right Dewey Decimal number, and locating the physical book on the shelf. There was no Google. Writing a research paper meant hours in the library with encyclopedias and books, taking notes on index cards, then typing the final paper on a typewriter. Mistakes required correction fluid or starting over. Gym class was mandatory and often dreaded. Climbing ropes hung from the ceiling. The presidential fitness test measured how many sit-ups and pull-ups students could do. Dodgeball was still legal and could be brutal. The locker room smelled exactly how one might imagine, and changing in front of classmates was just part of the experience. Getting to school varied by location and age. Freshmen and sophomores without licenses depended on the school bus, parents, or older friends. The yellow school bus was a social space of its own, with the cool kids claiming the back seats. For juniors and seniors who could drive, the student parking lot was a status display. American muscle cars, pickup trucks, and by the late 1980s, small Japanese imports filled the spaces. Having a car meant freedom, and that freedom defined teenage life. The mall was the undisputed center of teenage social life in America in the 1980s. On any given Friday or Saturday night, the local mall was packed with teenagers, not necessarily buying anything, just being there. Walking the corridors, seeing and being seen, hoping to run into someone interesting. Parents would drop teenagers off at the mall entrance with instructions to meet back in 3 hours. What happened in between was teenage social life at its purest. The food court was home base. Groups would claim tables and sit for hours, nursing a single soda or sharing a basket of fries. The food court offered choices that felt exotic at the time: Orange Julius, Sbarro Pizza, Chick-fil-A in some regions, and the ever-present McDonald's. Teenagers would make loops around the mall, passing by the same stores and the same groups of kids, each pass an opportunity for eye contact or conversation. Stores catered specifically to teenagers. Chess King and Merry-Go-Round sold the trendy clothes. Spencer Gifts was edgy with its black lights and novelty items. Sam Goody and Musicland sold records and cassettes. Walden Books and B. Dalton had the paperbacks. The department stores anchored each end of the mall, but teenagers rarely ventured into Sears or J.C. Penney unless dragged there by parents. The arcade was magnetic. Rows of video game cabinets glowed in dim light, and the sounds of explosions and electronic music blended together. Games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Galaga, and later Double Dragon and Street Fighter filled the floor. Teenagers would spend their allowance one quarter at a time, trying to get their initials on the high-score screen. The arcade was dark and loud and felt slightly forbidden, which made it perfect. Before we continue with the music, fashion, and dating culture that defined these years, if you are enjoying this look back at how teenagers really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Americans grew up before the world we know today. Music was everything to 1980s teenagers, and MTV changed how they experienced it. The channel launched in 1981, and by the mid-1980s, it was essential viewing. Music videos made artists into visual icons. It was not enough to hear a song anymore. Teenagers needed to see the video, know the choreography, understand the aesthetic. Michael Jackson's Thriller was not just an album. It was a cultural event with a 14-minute video that premiered like a movie. The Walkman was revolutionary technology. The ability to take music anywhere, to create a personal soundtrack while walking to school or riding the bus, felt like science fiction made real. Teenagers saved up for a Walkman and then spent their money on cassette tapes. Making mixtapes was an art form. Recording songs off the radio required patience and timing, hitting the record button at exactly the right moment and stopping before the DJ talked over the ending. The music itself was diverse. Pop dominated with Madonna, Prince, and Michael Jackson at the top. Rock remained strong with Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, and Van Halen filling arenas. New Wave brought synthesizers and British bands like Duran Duran and Depeche Mode. Hip-hop was emerging from New York, with Run DMC and the Beastie Boys crossing over to mainstream audiences. Hair metal bands with their spandex and power ballads ruled the Sunset Strip. Whatever a teenager was into, there was a tribe that shared that taste. Concerts were major events. Seeing a favorite band live required buying tickets in person or by phone, often waiting in line for hours. There were no online sales, no pre-sales, no algorithms. Getting good seats meant dedication. The concert itself was experienced in the moment. No one held up phones to record. Everyone just watched and listened and felt it. Fashion in the 1980s was loud and unmistakable. The decade rejected the earth tones of the 1970s in favor of neon brights, bold patterns, and excess. Teenage girls teased their hair to impossible heights using Aquanet hairspray in quantities that probably damaged the ozone layer. Shoulder pads made everyone look broader. Leg warmers worn outside of dance class somehow became fashion. For guys, the look evolved throughout the decade. The early 1980s meant preppy styles with polo shirts, khakis, and boat shoes. By mid-decade, the Miami Vice influence brought pastels and linen blazers worn with t-shirts underneath. Hair got bigger for everyone. Mullets were acceptable. Actually, they were stylish. Business in the front, party in the back was a genuine philosophy. Jeans were crucial. Jordache, Guess, and Gloria Vanderbilt defined girls' denim. Levi's 501s were the go-to for guys. Acid wash denim appeared mid-decade and covered everything from jeans to jackets. Parachute pants had their moment. Members-only jackets were essential. Nike and Reebok fought for dominance on teenage feet with high tops as the preferred style. The different social groups had their own fashion codes. Preppies wore Izod and LL Bean. New wave kids wore black and styled their hair with gel. Metalheads had band t-shirts and ripped jeans. Each outfit was a declaration of identity, a signal to others about what music you listened to and who your people were. Dating and social life operated by completely different rules before cell phones and social media. Asking someone out required courage because it had to happen in person or over the phone, and calling meant dialing their house and potentially talking to their parents first. The terror of asking if someone was home while their father asked who was calling cannot be overstated. Going out meant actually going somewhere together. Movies were the classic first date. The multiplex at the mall showed the latest releases. Footloose, The Breakfast Club, Pretty in Pink, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off were not just movies, but cultural touchstones that defined the teenage experience. John Hughes understood teenagers in a way that felt almost supernatural, and his films gave teens in the 1980s a mirror to see themselves. Couples communicated through landline phones, stretching the cord as far as it would go for privacy, or tying up the family phone line for hours until parents demanded it back. There was no texting to say goodnight. Relationships required actual conversation. Breaking up had to happen face-to-face or over the phone. There was no ghosting because there was no way to simply stop responding to messages. Prom was enormous, a rite of passage that required weeks of preparation. Girls shopped for dresses, guys rented tuxedos, and everyone worried about who was going with whom. Promposals were not yet a thing. Asking someone to prom was nerve-wracking but simple. The night itself involved photographs in someone's backyard, dinner at a nice restaurant, the dance, and then often an all-night party, sanctioned by parents who preferred to know where everyone was. Part-time jobs were common for teenagers who wanted spending money. Fast food restaurants, grocery stores, movie theaters, and retail shops at the mall all employed high school students. Minimum wage was low, but so were expectations for teenage expenses. A job meant gas money, concert tickets, new clothes, and maybe saving for a car. The jobs themselves taught lessons about responsibility and dealing with the public that school could not provide. Summer meant freedom. 3 months without school, long days that stretched into warm evenings, and time that seemed endless. Teenagers with access to pools spent hours there. Others gathered at beaches, parks, or just in someone's backyard. Summer jobs were more intense, with more hours available. Lifeguarding was a coveted position. Cutting lawns paid well. Working at the local amusement park or summer camp was popular. The economy of the 1980s shaped teenage experience in subtle ways. The recession in the early 1980s hit families hard, and even as the economy recovered, not every family shared in the prosperity. Having money for extras depended on a family's circumstances. Some teenagers had everything handed to them. Others worked for everything they had. Those differences showed up in what people wore, the cars they drove, and where they could afford to go. The Cold War still provided an undercurrent of anxiety. Nuclear war remained a genuine fear. The day after, a television movie depicting nuclear apocalypse traumatized viewers when it aired in 1983. Teenagers grew up doing nuclear drills, crouching under desks as if that would help. The Soviet Union was the enemy, and the possibility of everything ending in nuclear fire was something teenagers carried with them even as they went about normal life. By the late 1980s, personal computers were appearing in some homes. The Commodore 64, Apple IIe, and eventually IBM PC compatibles offered games and basic computing. Oregon Trail was played in school computer labs. Some teenagers learned to program in BASIC. The internet existed in primitive form, and it was for universities and the military. The connected world that would reshape everything was still years away. Teenagers in the 1980s lived in the last era of true disconnection. What defined teenage life in the 1980s America was presence. Being somewhere meant being there completely. Friendships were built on time spent together, not messages exchanged. Missing a phone call meant missing it. Being out of touch was the default state. This created both limitations and freedom. Parents could not track their teenagers. Teenagers could not be reached once they left the house. Whatever happened out in the world stayed between those who were there. The decade had its challenges. Pressure to conform was intense. Bullying happened without documentation. AIDS emerged and created fear around sexuality. Drug awareness programs like Just Say No oversimplified complex issues. Not every teenager thrived, and those who did not fit in often struggled without the online communities that would later provide connection. But for many, these years held something golden. Friday nights at the mall with friends, Saturday afternoons at the arcade, Sunday dinners with family, passing notes in class, recording songs off the radio, driving around with no destination, just enjoying the freedom of the road. The 1980s teenager existed in a world that required initiative and courage for basic social interaction. Every friendship was built in person. Every relationship required showing up. Every experience was shared only with those who were present. There was no documenting life for an audience. There was just living it. For those who remember being young in that decade, the memories have a particular texture. The sound of a cassette tape rewinding, the feel of arcade buttons under fingers, the anticipation of the phone ringing and hoping it was the right person, the particular satisfaction of a perfect mixtape, a world that existed completely in the moment because there was no other way to exist. For those with memories of this remarkable era, there is always more history to explore.